In 1847 Oregon, a man could buy another man's daughter for $50. But lonely lumberjack Jonas Whitmore wasn't just buying a wife. He was buying a secret that was growing in the womb of a 17-year-old girl named Sarah, a secret that would bring a winter of blood and fire to his quiet cabin in the pines, and a secret that would answer a prayer he'd been whispering to the trees for 17 long years. This is the story of how a simple transaction at a muddy marketplace became a fight for survival against the darkest parts of the human heart. Jonas Whitmore's axe was the only voice that ever answered him. Thwack. It bit deep into an old-growth pine, the sound echoing for miles across the empty Oregon mountains. Thwack. Wood chips flew like angry hornets. For 3 years this was his life. Wake, chop, eat, sleep, alone. The year was 1847. The Oregon Territory was a wild, unforgiving place. Men came here chasing dreams of gold or land or a new beginning with a wife and a brood of kids. Jonas came to forget, and every day the silence reminded him of what he'd lost. He'd see the other loggers at camp, laughing about their families. Big Tom complaining about his wife's terrible stew. Young Pete showing off a crude wooden bird his boy had whittled. Even old Henrik, who hadn't smiled since his teeth fell out, would get a little misty-eyed, talking about his daughter's letters. They'd invite him for Sunday dinner. "Martha's making her famous pie, Jonas," Frank Muller, the camp cook, would shout. Jonas would just smile and shake his head. "Got work to do," he'd say. The truth was, sitting at a table filled with a happy family felt like swallowing glass. The silence of his own cabin was easier. In his cabin, he could pretend he chose to be alone. But the trees knew. The trees heard him talking to the ghosts of a wife and child he'd buried back in Pennsylvania. They heard him pray at night, his voice rough and quiet, asking God for a sign. Just a sign that he wasn't forgotten, that he hadn't been sentenced to a life of hollow echoes. He was a master with an axe. The foreman, Thomas Brennan, said Jonas could read a tree's soul just by looking at its bark. He could drop a 100-foot giant on a dime. The men respected his skill. They just didn't understand his solitude. "There's a new family in town, Jonas," young Pete said one afternoon, sidling up to him. "Got 3 daughters, all of them prettier than a spring sunrise." "I'm fine as I am," Jonas said, not looking up from his sharpening stone. He'd tried before. Back east, the girls wanted men with smooth hands and even smoother words. Men who promised towns and parties, not a lifetime of listening to the wind howl through the pines. Jonas's hands were calloused, and his words were few. He was a man made of wood and silence. That evening, he walked back to his cabin as the sun bled out behind the mountains. It was a good cabin, strong. He'd built it himself, with glass windows and a hearth big enough to warm a family. He'd even built the bed wide enough for 2, just in case God ever remembered his name. He ate his beans and bacon alone. He sat by the fire and carved a small wooden bird, its wings outstretched as if it were about to take flight. He told himself it was just a way to pass the time, but his hands knew better. They were carving a toy. Later, he knelt by the simple cross on his wall. "Lord," he whispered into the quiet, "I'm not asking for a miracle, just someone to share the silence with." Outside, an owl hooted, a lonely question in the dark. Somewhere, far away, another answered. Jonas blew out the lamp and climbed into his cold, empty bed. He had no way of knowing that his prayer was about to be answered, but sometimes God answers prayers in ways that look a lot like damnation. The trip to Portland was a necessary evil. Once a month, Jonas would ride down from his mountain to stock up on flour, coffee, nails, and salt. He hated the noise, the crowds, the smell of too many people packed into one muddy place. He usually got what he needed and got out fast, desperate for the clean air of his forest. But this time was different. The air in the market square crackled with a strange energy, a tension that made the hair on Jonas's arm stand up. He slowed his pace, watching the faces in the crowd, listening to the buzz of 1,000 conversations. That's when he saw her. She was standing next to a rickety wagon, her father gripping her arm like she was a runaway horse. She was maybe 17, maybe 18. Her dress was faded and patched, her hair tied back in a simple braid. But she stood with a quiet dignity that was so out of place, It was like seeing a wild deer in the middle of a saloon. Then he heard the father's voice, loud and raw, cutting through the market chatter. "She's a good worker." "Hoffer," the man shouted, his eyes wild and desperate. His name was William McKenna, and he looked like a man who'd been wrestling with demons and losing badly. "Strong as any ox, knows her duties, 17 years old and ready for a good husband." A small, curious crowd started to gather. Jonas felt his stomach clench. He saw the girl, Sarah, her father called her, go pale, but she kept her chin high. She refused to let them see her break. "Starting price is $40, McKenna bellowed. "But I'll take 50 from the right man. Someone who understands how to handle damaged goods." Damaged goods. The words hung in the air like poison smoke. Jonas saw Sarah flinch, just for a second, a tiny crack in her stone facade. And in that moment, something inside Jonas, something that had been cold and dead for years, caught fire. "Papa, please," Sarah whispered, her voice too quiet for anyone but her father to hear. "There has to be another way." "Don't you start with me," McKenna hissed back, his voice a venomous whisper. "This is your fault as much as mine. If you'd been more careful, we wouldn't be in this mess." A few men in the crowd edged closer, their eyes crawling over Sarah like she was a piece of livestock. Jonas recognized one of them, Bill Hutchkins, a ranch hand with a reputation for being mean to his animals and even meaner to his women. $45, Hutchkins called out, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the mud. "For a girl with a questionable reputation, that's more than fair." McKenna's eyes lit up with a sick, desperate relief. "50, Mr. Hutchkins, and she's yours. She's worth every last penny, I swear it." As her father bartered away her life, Sarah's eyes swept across the crowd. They were blank, defeated. Then for a split second, they met Jonas's. And in that instant, he saw it. It wasn't just fear. It was a loneliness so deep and so vast, it was a perfect mirror of his own. He didn't think. He just acted. He pushed his way through the crowd, his boots sinking into the mud. Every eye turned to him, the big, quiet lumberjack from the mountains. $60, Jonas said. The word dropped into the marketplace like a stone into a silent pond. Hutchkins scowled. McKenna's jaw dropped. And Sarah stared at him, her eyes wide with a confusion that was slowly, cautiously, turning into a flicker of hope. 60? McKenna stammered, his greedy mind struggling to keep up. You got that on you, mister?" Jonas pulled out his worn leather wallet. He slowly, deliberately counted out the bills. It was his savings for the winter, money for a new axe, for repairs to his roof, maybe even for that better horse. It was his security. He held the money out. "But this isn't a sale," Jonas said, his voice low and firm, cutting through the excited whispers of the crowd. He looked past McKenna, straight at Sarah. "It's a proposal for marriage. If the lady agrees." McKenna's face twisted, greed warring with confusion. "Well, girl, what do you say?" he demanded. Jonas took another step forward, ignoring the father completely. He was speaking only to her now. "My name is Jonas Whitmore. I have a cabin up in the mountains. It's not fancy, but it's warm and it's strong. I'm not offering to buy you. I'm asking if you'd consider sharing my life." Sarah looked at him, really looked at him. Her green eyes searched his face, looking for the trap, for the trick. Jonas just stood there, letting her see him for what he was. A simple man, a lonely man, a man offering the only thing he had left to give, a safe harbor. The entire market seemed to hold its breath. Finally she spoke. Her voice was quiet, but as clear and steady as a church bell on a Sunday morning. "Yes, Mr. Whitmore," she said, "I'll marry you." The journey to the cabin was made in near silence. Sarah sat beside him on the wagon seat, her hands folded in her lap, her back ramrod straight. She looked at the towering pines and the endless sea of green with a kind of detached curiosity, like a passenger on a train to a destination she never chose. Jonas tried to make conversation a few times. He pointed out a hawk circling high above. He mentioned that the creek they were following was full of trout. She would just nod, a polite, empty gesture that built a wall between them, just as surely as if it were made of stone. He couldn't blame her. He had bought her. That was the plain truth of it. He dressed it up in the clothes of a marriage proposal, but the money had changed hands. Her father had pocketed his $60, shoved a small battered trunk into the back of the wagon, and walked away without so much as a goodbye. Jonas felt like he'd stolen something precious and broken it in the process. When they finally arrived at the clearing, he saw the cabin through her eyes. To him it was home, a fortress against the loneliness. But to her, it was just a small wooden box in the middle of nowhere. A prison. It's not much, he said, the words feeling clumsy and inadequate. It's very sturdy, she replied, her voice neutral. The first few days were a careful, quiet dance. Jonas would go out to chop wood, and when he returned, the cabin would be scrubbed clean. His mending pile would be smaller, and there would be a pot of something warm and savory on the stove. She was a tireless worker, moving through his space with a ghostly efficiency. She was earning her keep. The thought made Jonas's stomach churn. One evening, he came in to find her at his table, her hands covered in flour, kneading a lump of dough with a practiced rhythmic motion. The cabin was filled with the warm, sweet smell of rising bread, a smell he hadn't experienced in years, a smell that felt like home. "You don't have to do all this," he said gently, hanging his heavy coat on a peg. "I want to," she said, not looking up. "It's the least I can do." He watched her for a moment, the way the firelight caught the stray strands of her brown hair. He saw that her knuckles were red and raw from scrubbing. He saw the faint, dark circles under her eyes. She was trying so hard to be useful, to be invisible, to not be a burden. "Sarah," he said, sitting down at the table across from her. "We need to talk." Her hands stilled. She froze, her eyes fixed on the dough. He could see the fear creeping back into her expression, the same fear he'd seen in the marketplace. "About this arrangement," he continued, choosing his words carefully. "I know this wasn't your choice. Your father, he left you no options. If you want to leave, I'll help you. I have some money left. I can get you a ticket on a stagecoach east. Find you a place to stay." She finally looked up at him. Her green eyes were swimming with tears she refused to let fall. "Where would I go?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "I have no one." She looked away toward the window, at the endless wall of dark trees that surrounded them. She was quiet for so long, Jonas thought she wouldn't say anything more. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the soft sigh of the wind outside. "There's something I have to tell you," she said at last, her voice barely audible. "Something my father didn't mention. The real reason he called me. What he called me." Jonas waited. He sensed he was standing on the edge of a cliff, and the ground was about to give way. "I'm afraid," she whispered, turning to face him. Her face was a mask of terror and shame. "I'm afraid when you know the truth, you'll send me away." "I won't send you away," he said, and he was surprised by how much he meant it. "Whatever it is, we'll face it. Together." She took a deep, shuddering breath, like a diver about to plunge into icy water. "I'm going to have a baby." The words landed in the quiet cabin with the force of a falling tree. Jonas just stared at her. A baby. His mind reeled, trying to make sense of it. The way she held her body, the loose-fitting dress, the reason her father had been so desperate, damaged goods. It all clicked into place with a horrifying, sickening snap. How far along?" he managed to ask, his own voice sounding distant and strange. "4 months, I think," she whispered, her eyes searching his for the anger, the disgust she was so sure she'd find. "That's why he sold me. He said no decent man would want another man's leftovers." Jonas stood up and walked to the fireplace. He stared into the flames, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and a cold, rising anger. He thought of his own prayers. He'd asked for a family. He had begged God to fill the emptiness of his home. He had never, in his wildest dreams, imagined it would be like this. A wife he'd bought, a child that wasn't his, a family born from someone else's cruelty and shame. He turned back to her. She was standing by the table, her arms wrapped around her middle as if to protect the secret she'd just revealed. She looked so small, so young, so utterly broken. His anger wasn't for her. It was for the man who had done this to her, and for the father who had blamed her for it. He asked the question he knew he had to ask. the one that mattered more than anything else. Was it? Was it someone you cared for? No, she said, the word coming out sharp and bitter, like a shard of glass. It was not my choice. The simple, terrible truth of it settled in Jonas's chest like a lead weight. This wasn't just a mistake. This was a violation. He walked back to the table and looked at her, at this fragile, brave girl who had been so wronged by the world. And in that moment, the whirlwind in his mind went still. There was only one path forward. "Do you want to keep the baby?" he asked quietly. She looked at him, stunned. It was clearly the last question she expected. "What?" "The baby," he repeated. "Do you want it?" She hesitated, and he could see the war playing out on her face. The fear, the shame, the anger. But then something else softened her expression, a fierce, protective glint in her eyes. "I was scared at first," she admitted. "But yes, I think I do. It's not the baby's fault how it came to be." Jonas nodded slowly. A deep sense of clarity washed over him. He finally understood. God hadn't given him the family he'd asked for. He'd given him the family that needed him. "All right then," he said, his voice firm. "We'll raise it. Together." The unshed tears in Sarah's eyes finally broke free, streaming down her face in silent rivers. "You mean you're not going to send me away?" "Sarah," he said, and for the first time, he reached across the table and took her hand. Her fingers were cold as ice. "I have been alone in this cabin for a very long time. I have prayed for a family every single night. Maybe this isn't how I pictured it, but maybe God knows what he's doing, even when we don't." She let out a sob, a raw, ragged sound of disbelief and relief. He walked around the table and put his arms around her, holding her gently as she cried, her body shaking against his. "It's going to be all right," he murmured into her hair. "We'll figure it out." After a long time, she pulled back, wiping her eyes. "But what will people say? The loggers, the people in town?" "Let them say what they want," Jonah said, a new, hard strength in his voice. "This is our home, our life, not theirs." He looked at her, at the way the firelight danced in her tear-filled eyes. He looked at her belly where a new life was growing, and he felt it. The emptiness inside him, the hollow space where his own family used to be, was starting to fill. "This baby," he said, surprising himself, "it will need a father. I might not be its father by blood, but I can be its father in every way that matters." And for the first time since he'd met her, Sarah truly smiled. It was a small, watery thing, but it was real. It was a sunrise. "What do we do now?" she asked. Jonas looked around the cabin. His cabin. Their cabin. It wasn't just a shelter anymore. It was a sanctuary. "Now," he said, a smile of his own tugging at his lips. "Now we get ready. Winter is coming, and so is our baby." But outside, beyond the warm glow of the cabin, the Oregon wilderness held its own secrets. And a winter was coming that would be far darker and more dangerous than either of them could possibly imagine. The first snowflake landed on Jonas's cheek like a cold kiss. He looked up at the bruised purple sky and swore under his breath. It was only October. Winter was coming 6 weeks early, and it was coming with a vengeance. Inside the cabin, a new rhythm had taken hold. The steady thump-thump of Jonas's axe outside was answered by the steady click-clack of his mother's old sewing machine inside. Sarah, her belly now round and proud, was turning old flour sacks and worn-out shirts into tiny gowns and blankets. Life had settled into a fragile peace. They spoke more now, filling the silence with small talk about the weather, about the deer that came to the salt lick Jonas had set up, about what names they might like for the baby. He learned that she had a dry sense of humor and a laugh that sounded like wind chimes. She learned that his quietness wasn't anger, but a deep, steady calm. He started carving again. Not just birds, but a tiny, perfect cradle. The wood sanded so smooth it felt like polished stone. He worked on it every night by the fire, pouring all his unspoken hopes into the intricate carvings of leaves and vines that snaked around its edges. One afternoon, Sarah called him from inside, her voice sharp with excitement. "Jonas, come quick!" He dropped his axe, his heart seizing with panic. The baby. He burst through the door to find her standing by the window, a wide, wondrous smile on her face. "Feel this," she said, taking his large, calloused hand and pressing it against the side of her belly. He held his breath. At first, nothing. Then a distinct, firm thump against his palm, a little kick, a secret hello from a world away. Jonas laughed, a loud, booming sound that surprised them both. "Is that? That's our baby," Sarah said, her eyes shining. "Saying hello to its papa." He felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the fire. He knelt down, pressing his ear to her belly, and in the quiet of the cabin, he could hear it. A faint, frantic, fluttering heartbeat, the sound of their future. But their perfect moment was shattered by the sound of hoofbeats. Jonas looked out the window. 3 riders were approaching. Tom Brennan, the camp foreman, and 2 other loggers, Pete Morrison and Jake Williams. Their faces were grim. This wasn't a social call. "Stay inside," Jonas said to Sarah, his voice low. He stepped out onto the porch, pulling the door shut behind him. "Afternoon, Brennan." Brennan, a big man with a thick neck and small, shrewd eyes, didn't bother with pleasantries. "Whitmore, we need a word." "About what?" Jonas asked, though he already had a sinking feeling he knew. "About this situation," Brennan said, gesturing toward the cabin with his thumb. "Word's gotten around town about your wife and her condition." Jonas's jaw tightened. "That's my business." "It becomes our business when it affects the camp," Brennan said, his voice taking on a hard edge. "The other men's wives, they're talking. They don't like it. They say it's not decent, bringing a woman like that into our community." "A woman like what?" Jonas's voice was dangerously quiet. Pete Morrison, usually a friendly man, wouldn't meet his eye. "A woman who, well, comes to a marriage already carrying." "The company doesn't like scandal, Whitmore," Brennan continued. "It's bad for morale, bad for business. We think it would be best if you sent her away, at least until after the baby is born. Let her have it somewhere else. Then you can bring her back, and no one will be the wiser." Jonas stared at them. These were men he'd worked with, bled with. He'd once pulled Brennan out of the path of a falling widowmaker, saving his life. Now that same man was standing on his porch, telling him to cast out his pregnant wife into a blizzard that was brewing in the mountains. All because of gossip. "No," Jonas said. The word was flat, final. Brennan's eyes narrowed. "Don't be a fool, Jonas. Think about it. What are you going to do when her time comes? You're miles from any doctor. What if something goes wrong? You can't handle a birth out here alone, especially not with a situation like this. It's an unnatural thing. Things are bound to go wrong." There was something in the way Brennan said unnatural. A strange, personal venom that made the hairs on the back of Jonas's neck prickle. It wasn't just concern, it was a threat. "We'll manage," Jonas said, his hand unconsciously drifting toward the handle of the axe leaning against the porch rail. "What if she dies, Jonas?" Jake Williams piped up. "What if the bastard dies? Is your pride worth that?" The word bastard hit Jonas like a punch to the gut. He saw a flicker of movement in the window behind him. Sarah was listening. They were scaring her. And that was the last mistake they would make. "I'm going to say this one time," Jonas said, his voice dropping to a low growl that was more animal than human. "This is my land. That is my wife. And the baby she is carrying is my child. If you have a problem with that, you can turn your horses around and ride away. If you ever come back here with threats, you won't be riding away at all." The 3 men exchanged uneasy glances. They knew Jonas wasn't a man for idle threats. They saw the look in his eyes, the look of a cornered bear ready to protect its den. Brennan was the one who broke the silence. He spat on the ground, a contemptuous look on his face. "Have it your way, Whitmore. But don't come crying to us when you're bearing them both, come spring." He yanked his horse's reins and wheeled around, the other 2 following meekly behind. They rode off into the swirling snow, leaving a profound and chilling silence in their wake. The door opened behind him. Sarah stepped out, her face pale, a woolen shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. "They're right," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Maybe I should go." "No," Jonas said, turning and pulling her into his arms. "We are not running. We are not hiding. This is our home. We face this together. But as he held her, feeling the baby move between them, a cold dread began to seep into his bones. Brennan's visit wasn't just a warning from the town. It felt like something more, something personal. And Jonas had the terrible feeling that the storm gathering in the mountains was nothing compared to the storm that was heading directly for their door. The threat wasn't just from gossip anymore. It was from a man who, for some reason Jonas couldn't yet understand, wanted them gone, and was willing to do anything to make it happen. The peace was shattered. After Brennan's visit, the woods no longer felt like a sanctuary. They felt like they were closing in. Every snap of a twig, every hoot of an owl, made Jonas reach for his axe. He felt like he was being watched. He started finding things, small, unsettling things. A line of his traps, smashed and useless. A pile of freshly cut firewood, vanished overnight. One morning he found a deep scratch carved into the cabin door. A long, angry line, like a claw mark. It was Brennan. He knew it was. It was a campaign of fear designed to break them, to drive them out into the coming winter. Sarah felt it too. She stopped humming while she worked. She jumped at every sound. The joy and wonder of her pregnancy were being slowly choked out by a constant, creeping fear. "He won't stop, will he?" she said one night as they sat by the fire. The wind outside howled like a hungry wolf. "No," Jonas admitted, "he won't." The isolation he had once cherished had become a weapon used against them. They were utterly alone, trapped by the snow and by a faceless enemy who haunted the edges of their clearing. The final straw came a week later. Jonas had gone out to check on his horse, tethered in the small lean-to he'd built against the cabin. The horse was gone. The rope had been sliced clean through with a knife. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through Jonas's calm. Their only way out, their only way to get help if something went wrong with the baby. Gone. Now they were well and truly stranded. That was when Sarah finally broke. "It's my fault," she sobbed, burying her face in her hands. "All of this. I brought this trouble to you. I should have just disappeared." "Don't say that," Jonas said, kneeling in front of her, taking her hands in his. "None of this is your fault." "But it is," she cried, looking at him, her eyes wild with desperation. "You don't understand. You don't know the whole truth." "What truth?" he asked gently. "Sarah, what are you not telling me?" She pulled her hands away, pacing the small cabin like a caged animal. "When I told you the baby wasn't from someone I loved, that it wasn't my choice, I didn't tell you who it was." Jonas's blood ran cold. He had assumed it was some stranger, some traveler passing through. But as he looked at her terror, at the pieces of the puzzle that had been tormenting him, Brennan's strange venom, his obsession with getting rid of them, it all began to slot into place. A horrifying, unthinkable picture began to form in his mind. "Who was it, Sarah?" he whispered, dreading the answer. She stopped pacing and looked at him, tears streaming down her face. "He was my father's boss at the old logging camp. My father owed him money, a lot of money. One night he came to collect. My father, he let him." She choked on a sob. "He let him into my room. He stood outside the door and let it happen." The air in the cabin became thick, unbreathable. Jonas felt like he was drowning. He finally understood the depths of McKenna's cruelty, the true reason for his shame. "Who?" Jonas asked again, his voice a raw whisper. Sarah took a ragged breath and finally said the name of the man who had visited their porch, the name of the man who was now hunting them in the woods. It was Thomas Brennan. The name hit Jonas like a physical blow. Brennan, the foreman, his boss, the man whose life he had saved, the father of the child in Sarah's womb. It all made a sickening kind of sense. Brennan wasn't just trying to avoid a scandal, he was trying to bury his crime. Sarah and her baby were living, breathing evidence of what he had done, and he would stop at nothing to make them disappear. They weren't just being threatened, they were being hunted. "We have to leave," Jonas said, his mind racing. "We can walk. We can make it to the next town if we—" He was cut off by a sound from outside, a sound that made both of their heads snap toward the door. It was the unmistakable, terrifying sound of a horse, and then a voice, slurred with whiskey but sharp with menace, boomed across their clearing. A voice from a nightmare they thought they had left behind in the Portland marketplace. Whitmore, get out here! I've come back for my property! It was William McKenna, and he wasn't alone. Standing beside him, a cruel smirk on his face, was the foreman, Thomas Brennan. Jonas grabbed his axe. Sarah scrambled to hide behind the bed, one hand protectively on her belly. The siege had begun. "What do you want, McKenna?" Jonas shouted through the closed door. "A little misunderstanding, Whitmore," McKenna called back, his voice thick with false cheerfulness. "Turns out my daughter is more valuable than I thought. Mr. Brennan here has made me a much better offer." "She's my wife," Jonas yelled, his knuckles white on the axe handle. "Not for long." Brennan's voice cut through the night, cold and hard as iron. "We know you're trapped. Your horse is gone. The snow is piling up. You can't last a week. Give us the girl, and we'll let you walk away." "Go to hell," Jonas snarled. There was a moment of silence, then a heavy thud against the cabin wall, followed by the terrifying smell of smoke. "They're trying to burn us out," Sarah whispered in horror. Jonas ran to the window. In the flickering firelight, he could see them. McKenna was holding a torch, pressing it against the dry logs of the cabin. Brennan stood back, a rifle cradled in his arms, watching, waiting. Another thud as a burning log hit the roof. Smoke began to curl down from the rafters. "There's a root cellar," Jonas said, thinking fast. "The trap door is under the rug. We can wait them out in there." But as he moved to pull the rug back, Sarah cried out. It wasn't a cry of fear. It was a sharp, guttural gasp of pain. She doubled over, clutching her belly. "Jonas!" she panted, her eyes wide with a new kind of terror. "The baby, it's coming. It's coming now." Fire on the outside, and the miracle of birth on the inside. A circle of hell had closed around them. The cabin was an oven. Smoke filled the air, stinging their eyes, making every breath a battle. Outside, Brennan and McKenna laughed, their shadows dancing like demons in the light of the flames they'd set. "Push, Sarah! You have to push!" Jonas begged, his voice raw from the smoke. He had dragged their mattress to the center of the floor, as far from the burning walls as possible. He was trying to remember what the doctor's books had said, but his mind was a chaotic mess of fear and desperation. Sarah screamed, a sound of pure agony that was answered by the crackle of the fire eating away at their home. The roof was groaning, threatening to collapse. Time was running out. "I can't," she cried, her strength failing. "I'm so tired." "Yes, you can," Jonas said, wiping the sweat from her forehead with a smoke-stained rag. "You are the strongest person I have ever known. Now you push for our baby. You push." He could hear McKenna outside shouting taunts. "Give it up, Whitmore. Come out and die like a man." Anger, pure and white-hot, surged through Jonas. He looked at Sarah, her face pale and strained. He looked at the burning walls of the home they had built together, and he made a choice. "Keep pushing," he said to Sarah, his voice deadly calm. He grabbed his axe. "I'll be right back." He kicked open the cabin door and charged out into the fiery night, a primal roar tearing from his throat. McKenna was so surprised he barely had time to raise his torch. Jonas swung the flat of his axe, not the blade, and slammed it into McKenna's side. The man crumpled to the ground, howling in pain, the torch flying from his hand and extinguishing in the snow. Brennan was faster. He raised his rifle. The shot exploded, the bullet whizzing past Jonas's ear, so close he felt its heat. Before Brennan could fire again, Jonas was on him. He didn't use the axe. He used his fists, his rage giving him a strength he didn't know he possessed. He was a force of nature, a man with nothing left to lose. He tackled Brennan to the ground, the rifle flying into a snowdrift. They rolled in the mud and snow, a tangle of limbs and fury. Brennan was bigger, but Jonas was fueled by something more powerful than size. He was fighting for his family. He slammed Brennan's head against the frozen ground, once, twice. The foreman went limp. Jonas staggered to his feet, breathing heavily, his body bruised and battered. He looked at the two men, one groaning, one unconscious. He looked at his burning cabin, and then he heard it. Over the roar of the fire, a new sound, a thin, reedy cry. The baby. He scrambled back inside the inferno. The main roof beam was engulfed in flames, showering sparks down onto the floor. Sarah was lying on the mattress, exhausted but radiant. a tiny, squirming bundle wrapped in a blanket resting on her chest. "It's a girl," she whispered, tears of joy and relief streaming down her smoke-smudged face. Jonas knelt beside them, oblivious to the fire, to the danger, to everything but the miracle in front of him. He looked at the baby. She had a full head of dark hair, a tiny, perfect mouth, and bright, curious eyes. And on the back of her tiny hand, just above the knuckle, was a small, uniquely shaped brown birthmark. A birthmark that was the exact mirror image of the one on Thomas Brennan's left hand. There was no denying it. She was Brennan's daughter. But as Jonas looked at her, at this impossible child born of violence and fire, he felt no trace of doubt. He felt nothing but a wave of love so fierce and so overwhelming it brought him to his knees. He reached out a trembling finger and touched her cheek. "Hello, Grace," he whispered. Just then the main beam overhead gave a final, tortured groan and collapsed, sending a wall of flame and smoke crashing down. Jonas threw his own body over Sarah and the baby, shielding them, waiting for the end. But the end didn't come. Through the smoke and chaos, figures emerged. Men with buckets of water. It was the other loggers. Young Pete, Frank Muller, even old Henrik. They had seen the fire from the camp and had come running. And behind them, riding hard, was the town sheriff. Young Pete had seen Brennan and McKenna ride out, drunk and armed, and his conscience had finally won. He had ridden for help. They pulled Jonas, Sarah, and baby Grace from the wreckage of the cabin just as the rest of the roof caved in. The sheriff found Brennan stirring in the snow and McKenna clutching his broken ribs. Sarah, weak but determined, held up a small, tarnished silver button she had clutched in her fist. "It came off his coat," she said, her voice clear and strong. "That night, I tore it off when he—" She didn't have to finish. The sheriff looked from the button to the matching empty spot on Brennan's waistcoat. He looked at the birthmark on the baby's hand. He looked at the defeated, guilty faces of the two men. Justice, swift and sure, had finally arrived in the Oregon wilderness. They rebuilt. The loggers, ashamed of their judgment and in awe of Jonas's courage, helped him raise a new cabin before the first deep snows of winter set in. It was bigger than the old one, with a room just for Grace, and windows that let in the morning sun. The town that had once shunned them now embraced them. The story of their trial by fire became a local legend. Women would bring gifts for the baby, quilts, preserves, little knitted booties. They would look at Sarah not with pity, but with a quiet respect. Brennan and McKenna were sent to a territorial prison, their names fading into a dark footnote in the town's history. Jonas Whitmore was no longer the lonely lumberjack. He was a husband. He was a father. His cabin was no longer silent. It was filled with the gurgles and cries of a baby girl and the soft, happy laughter of the woman he loved. Sometimes late at night, he would stand over Grace's cradle, the one he had carved, and watch her sleep. He would look at her tiny face, at the dark hair she got from her mother, and the stubborn chin she got from, well, it didn't matter where she got it. He knew what the world would call him, a fool, a man raising another man's child. But Jonas knew the truth. Fatherhood wasn't about blood. It was about choice. It was about showing up. It was about running into a burning building, not away from it. It was about seeing a tiny hand reach for yours in the dark and never, ever letting go. He had prayed to God for a family, and God had answered. Not in the easy way he had expected, but in the way he had needed. He had been given a broken girl and a secret baby, and together, in the heart of a wild and unforgiving land, they had built something stronger and more beautiful than he had ever dared to dream. They had built a home. If you enjoyed this story of how love can be forged in the most unexpected of fires, do us a favor and hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. And let us know in the comments, what do you think truly defines a family? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Thanks for listening.